The Market Like a Fintech podcast is back. We've taken a hiatus of 3 years, and yes, now we're back. So much has happened and is still happening in the fintech and marketing industry that we really felt we needed to restart the podcast to properly explore what's going on. The plan with this podcast is to explore topics like attribution, ABM, branding, content, AI, social media, hiring, managing agencies, and so much more. We'll be publishing one episode per month to make sure we keep it consistent, and we've got some really exciting interviews lined up with some fantastic guests. Starting off with our first one, who is Katerina Nordin, Senior Vice President at Adyen, and is currently operating as their Head of Marketing and Revenue Operations. Now, if you're in fintech, Adyen likely needs no intro. It's one of the original and best-known fintech companies and currently the largest fintech in Europe by market cap. It's currently a publicly listed company on Euronext as well. But if you don't know about Adyen, they describe themselves as a financial technology platform that helps enterprise businesses accept payments on a single platform. In essence, it's a platform that allows merchants to have full control of the value chain that is payments. Katerina has a ton of experience in the marketing world, having previously worked at Ogilvy, and she's currently regularly on lists such as top 50 payment influencers and top 50 marketing executives. She's also been at Adyen for over 6 years, and as we'll see in this episode, there's a lot to explore. We talk about the difference between marketing to SMBs versus enterprise customers, what channels work best when reaching enterprise companies, Adyen's ABM setup, the best practices that they're actually trying to move away from, and their process for creating different types of content for different personas when targeting a buyer committee. You're listening to the Market Like a Fintech podcast. My name is Araminta, MD at Mid Studios and partner at the Fintech Marketing Hub. And with this podcast, my aim is to explore the strategies and tactics that top marketers around the world use to grow fintech companies. We have discussions about how to navigate compliance, the intricacies of marketing technical products, and targeting hard-to-reach ideal customers. All of that while living the startup life. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'd love if you could tell us a bit your journey when you were agency side, and also what is it that you feel you learnt a lot while at agencies that now you apply at Adyen?
Yeah, for sure. My journey actually started with my own business. I started in translations. Mm-hmm. And through doing translations, I started getting more and more assignments that brought me into the world of marketing. These were like the early days of trying to build a presence online. So I did a lot of the early kind of social stuff like, hey, I'm an influencer. I have a blog. It's popular in Sweden. I'd love to have international readers. How can I do that? That type of work, as well as working with more established advertising agencies on their pitches and whatnot. And from there, that became a bit of a springboard into being a copywriter and later on a planner strategist. I think working in an agency environment, I worked predominantly in advertising agencies, so either doing strategies that were more like brand strategies, or really doing campaigns with a heavy focus on TV. And later on, I started branching off more into social and PR. The biggest learning that I take away from that is the exposure that you have to so many different industries, to so many different brands. You really get to be close to so many different ways of doing marketing, or how many different businesses look at marketing. And I think if I look at what I've really taken with me is everyone is out there trying to do the same thing. They're trying to grab attention. It's always going to be about relevance. And what's difficult about capturing that relevance is you have to understand your audience. Your audience isn't static. They're in an environment that's ever changing too. Everything from the business priorities for the company where they work, if you're B2B, like we are at Adyen, but also just media consumption habits, expectations of like, how do I research to get the information that I need? All those things are shaped and influenced by the other things that we consume. So now we're living in a TikTok age. And I think we've seen with a little bit of a delay, that's now coming through. And we have Reels on Instagram. We have Reels on LinkedIn. It shapes the way that we consume media and therefore changes the rules for how to engage and be relevant. That's something I think agencies are really good at picking up on early. And at the same time, not being so distracted by the things that change, you also need to couple that with like a core insight about your audience. If you do those two things, you can be extremely successful with your marketing.
So is Adyen doing TikTok?
We're not doing TikTok, no. And I don't necessarily think it's being present on the channel, but it changes something. I think it changes, we talk a lot about that. Does it change the attention span? Maybe it doesn't change the attention span because we also see people engage with really long form content. So obviously there's room for that. Will people engage with a 20-minute long video though? Probably not. With a 5-minute video? With a 3-minute video? We're used to a short and snappy way of taking information in that kind of like motion format. And that's certainly something where I see so many of the trends and habits that are forming, maybe with younger generations, eventually they bleed through and they shape everyone's expectation.
I think it was LinkedIn Reels, right? Now you can go in the app and you can see videos in a similar style to TikTok, which I thought was quite interesting. And now all the apps, all the social media platforms are adopting it. So I wonder who's going to be able to own kind of these short reels on LinkedIn. Do you know anyone who's doing really, really well on LinkedIn videos or reels? Would you say in the fintech space?
I see individuals that are doing a good job on reels. And I think that's also an insight that a lot of B2B brands need to tap into. There's a brand called Cognism that you probably know. They're based in the UK, not in the fintech space, really excellent at demand generation. I think they've successfully profiled their own employees. Like their marketing leader is someone who really shows up and shares a lot around her playbook. So that tactic of having your own people and have them show up in a way that's attached to the brand but still really human seems to be resonating. And whilst I haven't really seen a brand yet that's tapped into the reels, that's probably my expectation of how a brand could do that successfully by leveraging their own people as opposed to just having like short, snappy branded content. I don't know if that's what people are looking for.
Yeah, that's something maybe we could come back to, because I think it's quite difficult to do, leverage the people on your team to then create content on LinkedIn. But I want to go back to, let's talk about Adyen's marketing, because I think what we want to focus on in this episode is how you market to enterprise. And you do that really well. From the start, Adyen has been focused on enterprise. And so that's been like marketing has been mainly around that. So before we get into it, I kind of want to hear your thoughts on how would you say, is it different, marketing to enterprise versus SMBs or smaller companies?
One very real difference that everyone will notice instantly as they start to work on enterprise marketing is your target audience is more limited in terms of the number of companies that you're going after. So a lot of tactics that you might successfully have employed for SMB that build on reach don't really apply in the world of enterprise marketing. For a while when we were building up the marketing team at Adyen and we were hiring a lot of folks that had good digital skills, good demand gen skills, one of the things that many of them would share is like, yeah, we're going to do this push and then we'll retarget. And we're just like, we might not meet that retargeting threshold for all of our segments. What would you do that? So I think that there's a bunch of nifty things, particularly if you go back a couple of years, that marketers had in their playbooks that work definitely for B2C marketing when it's at scale and definitely for SMB marketing. And then for enterprise, it challenges some of your core assumptions of, I have this limited set of really valuable customers. What's the best way to reach them? What's the best way to engage them?
Yeah, you have to go really deep into what they're thinking and feeling. Like just off the top of my head, I'm thinking, for example, Google Ads. Google Ads performs best when you've got a high number of conversions. But when you're enterprise, you're looking for quality, not number of conversions. Immediately, your Google Ads can't be as effective because you're working with smaller numbers, right? So it's almost like qualitative rather than quantitative, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, and there might be folks in my team who will listen to this when it comes out who could definitely do a better job of going into like all the specific channels and all the specific formats. More from how do we set up the strategy and how do we think about success? Something that I urge teams to consider is it's not really meaningful how many leads we get in or not. And it's not so important to have the strongest lead to opportunity conversion rate. If we take Google ads or like search ads or even SEO, with those tactics, we certainly get like a broad base of interest that's not relevant that we have to filter out. Yeah. Where we get really highly relevant leads through. So it's about looking at, out of the tools that I have in my toolkit, what are the ways that I can really engage these accounts that we've identified that we know we're going after, or at a minimum where we know this is a segment relevant for our ICP, how can we make sure that we're touching those accounts? If you have to cast your net a tiny bit broader and it's not too costly, I wouldn't worry about that. And it's also not about the cost per lead. It's not about optimizing a few euros or dollars up or down. We have to take a much longer term perspective on holistically, are the marketing programs driving the outcomes that we're looking for? Yeah. And that's something that I think enterprise marketing has really taught me, and it's been a discovery together with the team. We can't be in the business of measuring everything. There's so much data that we have, but making sense of that data and really being able to take something from it is difficult. We also have to prepare that we're not going to be able to map out a journey exactly of how every single buyer out there decided for us. But we have to have a good enough understanding and good enough assumptions and be able to test kind of the core assumptions to see if we're being successful or not. So it's not measuring like, hey, this blog post gave us X or Y. I don't think that's the game in enterprise marketing as much as looking maybe like over this last like 3-month, 6-month period where we've been doing these pushes, and these are the themes we think will really resonate with our audience, and these are the demand capture moments that we set up for ourselves. What's successful, what's not successful, what's really translating through the pipeline, and how is that pipeline progressing?
Yeah, it's tricky because a lot of the marketing advice and marketing books out there are not for enterprise, right? They're for SMBs, and so you have to kind of step away from all the advice and everything that everyone tells you to do and actually do it differently, because you're saying like, you're not tracking everything and you're looking more at themes. That's kind of counter to what a lot of people say in the SMB space. So have you found that was quite a challenge, like having to step away from all the tons of advice and LinkedIn posts that will tell you to do X, Y, Z when really it might not apply to enterprise?
For me personally, I don't necessarily think that has been difficult, because as long as we have good evidence that what we're doing is generating a return, I think we can be pretty confident. I think the challenge when you're in a niche space, and something when we were preparing for this, we said we talk a little bit about best practices. I think this takes us on to that track. What is a best practice? Yeah. Like at its core, it's basically the accumulated wisdom of all of those that have come before you. Beautiful concept, that's great. But if they're operating in a wildly different business context than you, does it really apply? And that's where I think like it doesn't have to be binary. We dismiss all the wisdom out there or we follow it blindly. I think you have to take that test and learn mindset. Like, hey, first of all, there's just like a reasoning check. Would this work? Can I see this working? Like if I apply this advice, where would I expect that there would be a conflict with the way that I know my market operates, the way that I know that our sales cycles work, the way that our offering works? If there are really obvious conflicts, there should probably be a little bit skeptical about whether I'll apply it. If it's something where it's like, maybe that could be interesting, let's see, let's try. That's how we discover and that's how we learn. But certainly, like I think for a lot of people that are in their roles, one of the tangible examples I can give is that in most companies, sales reps will have a ton of metrics. They might even have goals on like how many calls they need to make, how many meetings they need to make. Like they really try to break down, like the ultimate thing I imagine they care about is revenue, but they try and break that down into a lot of smaller milestones. And it often means that the marketing teams are focused on how they can generate something that hits those milestones. And the positive thing in that model is it's pretty obvious what numbers you need to drive for the whole equation to work out. And that's something a few years ago when we were setting up marketing at Adyen and kind of preparing it for the future, we had a lot of discussions around how many goals should we have or not, because Adyen historically doesn't work with a lot of KPIs. We're not like a KPI driven culture. We're much more about, do we believe strongly that we have the right strategy? How can we be as intentional and selective as possible about the metrics we put out there? Because every goal, this is really something I've learned at Adyen, seeing it in practice, every goal you put out there that determines behavior can have a negative counter effect.
What's a good example of that?
I'll start with the sales side here because I think that's where it's really obvious. So we operate on the premise that we're here to really focus on our customers and help with their growth. And in payments, whilst let's say you might have a customer based, they could have a headquarters somewhere, maybe they're headquartered in London. They might be really interested in processing across multiple markets. Most don't necessarily have a payment provider per geography. So maybe they want to process in Germany, right? And they might even have an office there, and they might actually have a payments team there because there could be specific payment methods or nuances in the market that makes that relevant for them. At Adyen, we've set ourselves up to say that as a sales manager, you obviously focus on the companies that are headquartered where you are in your geography. But when you work with that customer, you sell globally. And if you need expertise from a different market, I gave Germany in the example, but that could be Singapore, that could be Japan, it could be Mexico, more complex markets, right? We encourage sales managers to work together, and we incentivize that behavior. So we might say like, hey, you should both work on this deal, call up this person in Mexico, work together. And that's been a huge recipe of success for us because we have immense knowledge sharing. We're really able to help our customers. We're able to be fast. It's a good thing from the customer's point of view. What happens when you start to install metrics, though, could be that if you say, hey, how am I going to measure your success? Am I only going to measure your success based on the customers that have country code UK? What if that company, ultimately, when you do the deal, they have a partial presence? How are you going to divide the credit? And I think some of these questions come up when you start to have many more metrics, especially metrics that gel seamlessly between all teams. Because whilst we think, hey, it totally makes sense to have these sales managers work as one globally, when you market, we actually market to a geography. So we'll market to the UK market, we'll market to the German market in German. So if you wanted to have perfect resonance between your marketing goals and your sales goals, down to like a meeting level, you end up with a ton of complexity. It doesn't work for us. So that's one of the areas where, yeah, there's a conventional model out there. Some might call it best practice, but there's always another side to that story. I think something that we do quite well is when we work with numbers and when we work with goals, it's always data with context. What's the long-term effect going to be of this? What's the implication on our strategy? Is it smart? Is it sound? Are we confident making a hard rule around this? It's still people running the business and not just numbers. And I think there are a ton of folks out there who would argue me or argue us on that.
No, that's really interesting. And because ultimately what you've done as Adyen is you've decided to move away from, and that takes guts, right? That's difficult sometimes, to move away from what best practices are and what everyone will tell you to do, perhaps even what consultants have told you, and said, okay, we're going to actually do it for us, like what actually works best for us. And that takes a lot of testing and time, probably. I'd be curious to hear any other best practices that you've found, maybe in the marketing world, that you are like, have found have not worked for you, or maybe just not worth even trying.
I think we talked a little bit about setting up a very linear digital funnel. That's certainly something that doesn't work. And I think that's probably true for a lot of enterprise brands out there. I think this idea that you're able to track all of your buyers' behavior and that you can always see their intent, blah, 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 blah. You can obviously better in some markets than in others, depending on a number of factors. But there's always going to be a dark funnel. There's always going to be offline behavior that you're not confidently tracking that we know is important. B2B especially is like a people-heavy business, right? Yep. Where there's a lot of human interaction that has like an enormous impact on the outcome, whether you win the deal or not. And so like we were talking about earlier, if best practice says that like, hey, you should have a very data-driven approach at all times. I think that there's a lot of benefit in that. The only thing that I would probably challenge is don't be anxious about the things you can't measure. There will always be gaps. And what sets a good marketer apart from an exceptional marketer is how we handle that ambiguity. Maybe there's something we haven't thought of that we can test. Maybe there is actually a way to have a data-driven small experiment around something that's traditionally harder to track or to understand. Maybe it's really just seeing like, hey, these are the assumptions that we made. If these assumptions are right, whether or not we can follow every step between points A and D, provided enough folks arrive at point D, we can feel pretty confident that this worked. Or we can do a correlation study. I think that like ingenuity and not being scared by what we don't know, but being a little bit excited and curious about it, that's something I don't necessarily see a lot written around on LinkedIn, but certainly something in my own experience that makes a huge difference for results. If you look at results as, pipeline and revenue.
Amazing. Well, I'd like to now talk a bit about Adyen as a whole. Like, what does your marketing look like nowadays? So let's start. We'll talk a bit about ABM because I know this is a big part of it. And I kind of wanted to start with channels because this is an easier way for listeners to get an understanding of what you're currently working on. And then we can talk about strategy overall. So yeah, what are some of the channels that you're working on at Adyen, and what have you found kind of works best with enterprise? Yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah, I think maybe to take a step back, if we're looking at what's the objective, let's say the objective is to bring new customers in. That is a big, long funnel. And then the reality for us is that pipeline is still early stage. Anything in payments, that's also transactions based. It's actually a long ramp up time or like a long growth runway with customers. So we're talking about extremely long timelines. Pipeline is something that we think is a good metric to work towards to measure success, particularly of sort of demand gen, demand capture, because there's a possibility of doing it within like a calendar year, like you can still see the impact come through there, and it's relevant enough as a business metric. So if we look at how would we set up a marketing program, or we're in planning now, how would a market plan for what they're going to do? There's a lot of focus around making sure that we have the right target accounts selected together with commercial leadership, spanning sales, SDR, partnerships, that we bring it down to like the teams that are actually executing, that they're heavily involved in this process and also own the planning. And then I would say that the tactics vary wildly and the channels vary wildly depending on the segment that you're going after and the market that you're in, how granular you want to be and how much you layer, let's say one to many, one to few, and one to one. If your segment is really small, there might not be a lot of one to many opportunities. So you have to be going after that one to few. We see a ton of success in our outbounding efforts in direct mail. We get a lot of traction in overall, and I think this is the other side outside of ABM, like a lot of traction through search. So on the one hand, you have these direct response channels where you're able to capture demand. On the other, I think going back to what we've been discussing, enterprise payments especially is a subject that's heavily researched. So having really solid SEO approaches, getting sharper with your content, making sure that you're educating in the right way, tying those themes and being selective of how much you're pushing out there, making sure that's also resonating in the earned activities that you're doing. We see a lot of traction coming through on inbound. So if I would take a channel perspective, we could probably talk about a few of these things that are working well. If we go more from like, what's the objective and what are we looking to achieve? Are we really clear that like, hey, this is our outbounding motion and these are the things that we need to do? Then that's probably where we see more variance. Yeah. I think I shared this actually when I was on stage. I was in a panel on ABM in Germany with this campaign, which was gardening themed. And it was like a little gardening kit that was sent out because they had this insight that the majority of the buyers they were going after were in a demographic where they really believed that gardening would hit home, and it was a wild success. I'm not certain that that's something that we would necessarily be able to replicate in all of our markets or with all of our segments. So sometimes we have those really niche, nice little moments, whereas on the other hand, this behavior that it's something that requires research, it's something that is a considered purchase, that I think we see ring true globally across all the markets that we're in.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool like example of direct mail, because you said direct mail works very well, and I know that's kind of like not so many companies do direct mail. So I imagine the gardening kit. So just to clarify, the gardening kit, you would send it to like what payment leaders at merchants, or who are you sending it to?
Yeah, so I think for that particular push, it was a home and garden segment. So they are working in home and garden.
Got it.
They researched some of these individuals. They saw that the digital presence was really low, like no LinkedIn profiles.
Yeah.
Probably not people that they can necessarily reach through as easily through a digital campaign. The push was, hey, let's do this nice kit with a bit of a gift, nothing too crazy. I think it was a few seeds and maybe like a gardening glove or something. A nice written piece about what we can do, and I think an invitation to an event.
And it was really successful.
It was really successful. It was really successful in this hyper niche segment. So that's where I feel like we can get a lot of traction out of it. I've also seen other direct mail pushes, and the trick almost always is how well do you understand the audience and make sure that you hit on something with a call to action that resonates.
The call to action might not be jump on a sales call. It might be come to an event. It has to be maybe a softer call to action.
And even in this, there's also a close collaboration with an outbounding SDR motions. They've probably been sending some emails. They're probably calling to follow up. So you're not going in completely without any context around who we are or any other way of reaching us.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is inbound or SEO and content. And I'll share in the show notes a case study that we did on your content that was really in depth and really good. On that case study, you said yourself that, and you just said now, that people do a lot of research. Prospects are, enterprise payments is an industry where people do a lot of research. And so that's why it's so important to be appearing online, not just in search, but also LinkedIn and other places. So what else have you found has worked there in terms of, like, they're trying to do a lot of research, but for example, they don't want just beginner content. They're looking for something more in depth. So what have you found has worked in terms of catering to prospects that do so much research, such as, for example, like appearing on Google and all of that?
Yeah, one of the things that we've noticed there is buying behavior around payments. It's something everyone has. It's not like you're selling something that no one's using today and you have to convince them. In a way, sometimes I say this, it's a bit like selling toilet paper, right? It is a necessity. Or like coffee. I'm from Sweden. Everyone has coffee at home, always. Yeah. So it's a staple. And then it's a question, I guess this is where you can say it becomes different. Whilst everyone maybe has the basic or foundational level, it's then a question of what are the capabilities that I really need to be successful? And many journeys to switch providers start with a tangible trigger. I'm entering into a geography. I need specific payment methods. That's tricky or expensive or technically not a sound solution based on my current setup. So let me consider what would be a better way for me to do that. I'm not going to go into the exact examples of where we see we have that traction. That's probably something that we'll keep to ourselves. It might be very different depending on what your offering is. But we can identify that there are specific areas where we know that there's more interest and also a need to bring a certain level of granularity into what you're doing. If the content doesn't let the reader kind of finish their mission, complete it, that leaves them at a point where they're probably not going to reach out further or consider us. So that's where we've seen that being able to go deeper, especially as we are a solution that is very comprehensive, we are very good at meeting these needs. That's where it's been effective for us to be able to connect the dots with the audience that's doing the research.
Nice. So I want to talk a bit about ABM because that's a big focus of Adyen's marketing. But I'll start with, you've done a few LinkedIn posts about how important it is to do more with less. So I'll start with that kind of angle. ABM depends so much on who you're targeting. There's so many different components to it. What have you found has worked, or some ways to do more with less with ABM? How to make it more optimized, I guess, for whatever your objectives are?
I think ABM in its most basic form is about a targeted motion. And in fact, I think all marketing at some point is about figuring out, how do I define the audience that I'm going after? Am I going to segment? Am I not going to segment? And what is the thing they all have in common? And with ABM, you basically buy into the premise that I'm going to divide my market up into smaller sets, perhaps even at the account level or at the persona level within an account. And I'm really going to go for the message that I think is most relevant to them. I think with enterprise, we see that the opportunity to bundle at scale is less, and it might force you to be too general in your messaging. Therefore, you don't stand out, or it's actually not possible for them to differentiate your offering from someone else's. So I think this is all about balancing, where can I group in order to have scale or reach or impact? And where do I need to be specific in order to effectively communicate value for that audience? Be that a selection of accounts at a vertical level or geographical level or use case level, or down to individual accounts or a small selection of accounts. To me, that's the foundational premise. And there is a ton out there about how you can do that in extremely sophisticated ways. But if that's just the premise of it, then it's really thinking about, what is the smartest grouping of my accounts? What are the things that I really believe will move the needle for them? What are my practical means of reaching them? And starting from there. And that's where I think we've seen, like I mentioned here, I find it delightful that we can have a lot of traction with direct mail and SDR. Isn't that wonderful? Then, of course, that there are a number of digital plays or ways that we can have reach through content syndication, or do follow-ups, or buy intent data, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, those are all complementary, like additional lenses to apply to the core foundation. And I have evidence to believe that you can be extremely successful by getting good at the basics. Those basics could be advertising on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
Well, when I look at doing more with less, I think there's always going to be an excellent way to execute with the means that you have, and there's going to be an average way. There's a huge difference between an insight-fueled activity, whether that is direct mail or a bigger campaign for a B2C brand. You see a lot of bland marketing out there, right? There's a lot of outbounding emails that go straight into the spam or trash folder. Yeah. There are a lot of send-outs that are trash, and they end up in the literal trash can.
Yep.
And there's a bunch of ads that you'll scroll past every day. And I'm not going to say that we get it right 99% of the time, but I think it's in the quality of the original thinking and the strategy that you can be more successful with ABM or less successful with ABM, as opposed to all the features that sometimes are even distracting.
Yeah. I think it's worth for listeners to know how you break down your audiences, because I think you have it in a very clear way instead of by a specific vertical. Do you want to share? So digital businesses, omnichannel, and then platform and businesses that have their own merchant relationships. Is that right? How you split your audience? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's also how we report on our success as a business.
Yeah.
And I think building a bit on what you just shared with these three audience groups, what we see is that the use case is different. If you are Spotify and you have no stores, right? Okay, you might have one pop-up somewhere, but you don't really have a physical presence. And then it's all about digital transactions. And whilst it might be the same product and has a single platform, we don't have different products for different segments necessarily. The core product is the same. the things that they need to be successful would be really different than an H&M that's probably interested in omnichannel and connecting channels and experience and loyalty and all those other things. And again, if you are a platform, if you're a SaaS company with your own SMB relationships, you're operating in a B2B model where you are probably facing a lot more complexity. There's more to cover there. Whilst ultimately the value that you can provide through payments might be the same, there are additional products that are needed, additional flows that are needed. KYC is a different game. We also really see the need to service those businesses in a different way. That's something that needs to be and is reflected in our marketing. For us, understanding these audiences, and then of course you have subsegments that live beneath them, and you can make that extremely granular by matrixing what kind of use case are they, what vertical are they in, what market are they in. And then of course there's additional segmentations that you can look at down to the account level or the persona level. So there's always a possibility of going like very, very granular. I think what helps us of having these three groupings at the top is more for activities where broader demand generation, what are the themes that we want to go out and really believe that we can add value through educating that merchant segment.
Yeah, I really like how these are split, because a lot of payment companies do it based on verticals. So, I don't know, SaaS or travel, whereas you've gone really specific on the pain points that they'll have or the use cases that they're trying to solve. And although it might be a little bit harder to target that as a keyword, it allows you to have a much better understanding of their pain points and what they might be searching as a result of that. So I thought that's really an interesting thing to highlight, like the approach you've taken to segmenting your audience.
Yeah, I think if we go full circle to where we started, relevance is a huge factor in everything that marketing aspires to drive. Like if we're not relevant, your license to engage someone kind of doesn't exist. Certainly it helps. Like pain points is one way to access it. I mean, there are a lot of successful payment companies out there. So there's definitely a ton of different ways to execute on it. But we have found with the way that we deliver value through our product and some of the things that we believe in, really being a global company with a global culture, always servicing the customer in a way that takes pain away from them, right? Like our internal divisions, definitions, or metrics should never impact that customer experience. If that's the starting point, then we think doing it in this way really helps us and also helps us stay focused on the things that are relevant to them and stay sharp in the messaging. But there's certainly challenges, and maybe we talked about things that we've seen that work. We've talked about some of the things that we're doing. But I also want to stress the fact that there are a ton of unknowns. I live in the camp of marketing. There are elements of it that make it a science. There are probably elements of it that make it an art. But a huge success factor is, how do you deal with that ambiguity? How do you deal with the things that you don't know? How do you find a way to test? When are you going to make a big bet? If you're not comfortable with that, then it's certainly a very challenging space to be in, because it is something where you see returns after time. I worked at Adyen for nearly 7 years, been in marketing for that entire time, for the last nearly 4 years as the global head of marketing. There are some things where we planted the seeds 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and we've remained consistent in that direction, and we're seeing the benefits now.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I want to finish off on that kind of topic. You said yourself, you're dealing with ambiguity. What are some things that you're going to call into question? Anything that you can share, of course, in 2025. What are some things that you're might be testing, or that you're going to start questioning or changing? Anything that you can share there, because I'm curious what you'll be looking at for next year.
Yeah, I think for us, one of the things that we're noodling on is, where do we want to have the power of consistency, and where do we want to give the autonomy to experiment? And consistency is really powerful, because something that you do consistently over a long period of time, that tends to be where you see transformational change. So that's certainly something that we're debating a little bit when it comes to demand generation. How many different points of view or themes should we be entertaining? How much flex should there be based on market and segment? And we're probably moving in the direction of more consistency over more experimentation. And we're curious to see what that's going to lead to. I think the thesis behind that is that there's only so much anyone can hold in their mind, and being consistent around a small set of things gives us more power to really connect with our audiences. So that's one of the bigger things that we're looking at. And then, of course, there are certain adjustments that we're looking, but we'll see how they play out, and maybe you'll have me back in a year or two and I can talk about how they played out.
Yes, that'd be awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Katerina, for coming on to our first episode after our relaunch. Big fan of Adyen's marketing and Adyen as a whole. So it's really an honor to have you. And thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was really fun.
Thank you for listening. You can find show notes and information about guests at fintechmarketinghub.com/podcast. And finally, huge thanks to orama.tv for producing this podcast. We look forward to having you on our next episode.